In order for a series to remain relevant and interesting, it is often necessary for the developers to embrace change and innovation. Square-Enix has never been one to shy away from this action, which has ensured its success in today's market. Risks are often involved with such undertakings, but more often than not, they are rewarded. In the 90s, many series seemed to enjoy innovating their sequential games in order to create a different experience, showcasing the development skills of creators that previously were regarded as novices. Final Fantasy II is no different. Originally released for the Famicon in Japan in 1988, it wouldn't see a Western release until 2003. But Venoir, I played it when I was a kid. You're wrong! I hear your protestations. To this I must clear the murky waters of the history of the Final Fantasy series yet again. True, in Western NTSC territories, Final Fantasy II was released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in 1991. However, this game was actually Final Fantasy IV, not the original Final Fantasy II. The correction of the naming conventions across all territories wasn't amended until the release of Final Fantasy VII, but that's another story. Final Fantasy II has received a number of ports and quasi-remakes throughout the years, changing some calculations and adding some new content. For the purposes of this review, I played the 20th Anniversary Edition, released on the Sony PlayStation Portable in NTSC territories in 2007 and PAL regions in 2008. Before we delve too far into this title, I wanted to point out that it is often overlooked and called the black sheep of the series, even by people who have never actually picked up the game. Final Fantasy II differs in a number of ways from the previous title in the series, which may have put a taste of bile in the throats of those who don't like the idea of change. The main culprit of this is the way in which character development is handled, via them gaining experience based on how they participate in combat, rather than gaining experience points like characters did in Final Fantasy, or even other contemporary titles of the time. This has led to the common misconception that in order to get anywhere, one must have characters attack themselves in order to gain HP. Well, I'm here to tell you that I played and beat this title, and the additional content Soul of Rebirth, without resorting to such an action, and never had much trouble with any of the encounters. Final Fantasy II can be played in just the same way as any of the other titles, allowing you to enjoy the game at your own pace. The game opens with a cutscene showcasing an androgynous character staring into a flame that they conjure within their palm, which crossfades to a burning village, and we're introduced to our main cast. Our protagonist is Firion, joined by his friends Maria, Guy, and Leon, who are fleeing from the destruction of their hometown. The being from the beginning of the cutscene is known as the Emperor, who has declared war on the entire world, conjuring an army of undead to do their bidding. Our characters barely escape the destruction of their village when they come face to face with some black knights that have pursued them. Attempting to stave off the attack in vain, our team faints and are later found by members of the Wild Rose, a resistance group who has arisen to oppose the Emperor. Taken back to the village of Altea, our characters are left to lick their wounds as they realise that Leon is missing, and that they are forbidden from joining the rebel forces because they are children, and will only get in the way. Whilst the opening premise of the game is basic, it gives the player the motivation to want to know more. Where is Leon? What is the Emperor going to do next? We must get revenge for the people of our hometown that the Emperor's forces murdered. As you explore Altea, you learn that the person in charge is Hilda, a princess of the Kingdom of Fynn, who has also been displaced, and it's from here that the children decide that they are going to become adults and help out the resistance in any way that they can. Final Fantasy II introduces a query system in conversation whereby any word that a character utters, highlighted in red, may be learned and then used to question other key characters. At first this is used to store the password Wild Rose, but expands to many other key terms that can be used across the course of the adventure. Additionally, some items can also be shown to characters in a similar way, which I thought was a very clever system for having originated on the Nintendo Entertainment System. I have seen some complaints that later in the game, some key terms result in a question mark when inquired about, but I feel like that isn't a negative point to the game. By the point that that happens, the terms that had already produced results usually are no longer relevant, so don't matter. I actually wonder if the lack of comments from characters later in the game on earlier keywords was done to preserve the limited cartridge space. Less than 1 megabyte, can you believe? After preparing for their adventure, our heroes set off into the wild to explore the world. I will note that one thing that did catch me off guard was that some tiles on the world map, even near to the beginning areas of the game, can put you into a battle with creatures that far outrank you, and you will quickly find yourself seeing the game over screen. When this happened to me, I hadn't yet saved the game, which forced me to restart the entire game from the beginning, although it was only about 30 minutes. After this, I learned that I should save often and everywhere. A tip from me is that anytime a character gains any type of statistic, especially rarer ones like magic defense, you should definitely save your game. And that's one thing I liked about this version of Final Fantasy II. You can save practically anywhere. Battles consist of random encounters that take your party to a different screen when initiated. I felt that Final Fantasy II handled the frequency of battles a lot better than the first game. The number of encounters you were drawn into felt less and more spaced out, which allowed me to focus on exploring the dungeon I was in. Within battle, characters are lined up on the right with enemies on the left. Sometimes if there are more than 4 enemies in the opposition party, only the enemies in the first 2 rows are able to attack, which took some of the panic out of the more crowded encounters. Your characters can attack, use magic, defend, use an item, or flee. The standard affair. But you need to consider each character's action as it will develop them in a certain way. For example, if you have Guy use spells that are typically considered white magic, then his spirit will increase. If Maria cops a smack to the face from an enemy's misguided fist, then her HP will increase. One thing that I will recommend though, is to have all characters in the front row and equip them all with shields. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Speaking of equipment, there is a variety to choose from. No character is locked to any specific weapon type, so you may have Guy using staves and Maria using axes if you really wanted to. Each equipment type has a level which can be increased through constant use. The higher a character has of proficiency with a weapon, the more attacks they will do in a single turn, and thus the higher damage output will be. It is nice to experiment with different weapons though, and better not to keep each character locked to one single type. For example, I had Ricard learn to be proficient with both daggers and spears. Magic works in a similar way in that it also levels as it is used. In the case of offensive magic, it will do more damage at higher levels, whereas support magic will have a higher chance to work and have a stronger potency. For example, if you don't build Eschewing, you may find that it often misses, even outside of battle. Final Fantasy II originates some staples of the series that would appear in either all later games or make cameos such as the Chocobo, Cid, Beavers, Bombs, Iron Giants, and Hilda, just to name a few. I enjoyed experiencing their origins, and it always put a smile on my face knowing what roles they would evolve into later in the series. Although why did the Beavers have to be a race that reputedly convert pixies into their ranks in Final Fantasy XIV? That's just so macabre. I do have one small complaint to make about the game, and it's actually a spoiler, so you should probably skip to here if you want to experience the game for yourself. Are you ready? Okay, I felt that the way that the story handled Leon was extremely unbelievable. So he becomes a Dark Knight for no reason other than he wants power, which I suppose could be a motivator, but we were never given enough narrative explanation about him to begin with. Additionally, after he declares himself the new Emperor, and the actual Emperor returns from Hell, the party just accepts Leon into the fold and Ricard gives up his own life to let them escape. I really think that more time should have been put into developing the relationships between the key party members so that it doesn't look like the developers did it just because they thought it was cool. It wasn't really redeeming at all, and I'd have rather just left Leon there to die and taken Ricard with me. Another point that I'd like to make about the characters is that the support cast have more personality to them than what the main cast does. Other than the fact that Guy can talk to monsters, specifically the Beavers, the other characters don't have any real presence within the narrative, which puts to mind Vaan and Penelo from Final Fantasy XII. Actually, to be fair, that pair had more of a narrative presence. Other than being refugees, the main cast of Final Fantasy II don't have any great stake in the story, and don't have any agency within it, as opposed to the supporting cast like Minwu, Layla, and Cid, who have valid reasons for being where they are and joining the party when they do. Unfortunately, if you get tired of the narrative, there isn't that much else that you can do. There is the Arcane Labyrinth, which first appeared in this edition of the game, though it isn't anything special. There are 3 such instances of this dungeon, and completing each one will allow you to gain a good item once you complete all of them. I found it to be a chore, so only attempted one. Basically, you approach a portal and give it one of the key terms that you have learned, which will determine the next floor of the dungeon. Some floors have no enemies, some have a lot, and some also have puzzles. One floor put me against a behemoth king, after which I didn't want to have anything to do with the dungeon anymore. The most annoying thing about these dungeons though, is that you cannot save at all during your spelunking, so if you die, then you have to restart the whole thing again. No thanks. Once you beat the game, you can challenge the Soul of Rebirth extra content, which is a little bit of extended story that occurs parallel to the ending of the game. It is a little more challenging than the main game because the characters you are given aren't that strong to begin with, but they can be leveled quite easily. And once you reach the town, you don't have to worry about preserving your strength and items. If you want a more rounded and complete ending to Final Fantasy II, you should definitely complete Soul of Rebirth. Graphically, I prefer the design of the characters in the 20th anniversary edition of the game to the recently released Pixel remaster. The characters may look big and chibi, but I like that they have a bit more detail to them, especially in battle. I also enjoy that the weapons that you equip to a character all distinctively display when the character wields them, and the spell effects are great in that not only do they pop on the screen, but there is a variety to them depending on whether you attack a single target or a group, and also what level the spell is at, which I thought was a nice touch. Some areas of the game also have nice particle effects that make the environments more robust and believable. The soundtrack for Final Fantasy II isn't really one that I would say I find myself revisiting often, but during the game the themes did fit the settings well. There are a few standout tracks that often circulated the internet back in the 90s, such as the main theme and the battle theme. But other than those, the other tracks don't have much merit outside the constraints of the game, for me. Also, the soundtrack for this game is smaller than that of the first game. Final Fantasy had 36 tracks, whereas Final Fantasy II only has 29. There are 2 tracks that I wanted to point out that I did like during the adventure. The first is called Battle Scene B, which is a boss theme that has a very exotic tone. When I first heard it, I didn't really like it, but it definitely grew on me. I also liked how it matches with the aesthetic of Minwu, who seems to be very heavily Middle Eastern influenced. The other track I really enjoyed is Magician's Tower. It sounds like a dark waltz and is a little macabre, but the reason I really love it is because it's also featured as a track in Chocobo Racing, and that version of this track is amazing. If you're looking for a big grand adventure, then Final Fantasy II won't give that to you, however it will give you a very unique and interesting level system that later made its way into the Saga series. For its time, the query system was a unique and interesting way to engage with the narrative, despite the fact that the main cast was overshadowed by the supports. The game is often called the black sheep of the series, and I feel that it is an unfair title to be given, considering that it tried to do something different. Sure, it may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I'd urge people to actually try it and play it the way it's supposed to be played before passing judgment. If anything, it's a short fun game that shouldn't take you that much more than 20 hours to complete, including the Soul of Rebirth extra content. By the way, are there games that exist which people love to hate upon but you actually enjoy? Tell me about it in the comments. This has been Venwa with a review of the 20th anniversary edition of Final Fantasy II for the Sony PlayStation Portable. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe for more great JRPG content. As always, thanks for watching, take care of yourselves, and I hope to see you all again next time. Bye bye for now.